Welcome to the LSU Sports Insider podcast, brought to you by the journalists at The Advocate, NOLA.com, and the Times-Picayune. My name is Perryn Keys. I'm the executive sports editor, joined today by Wilson Alexander. He's our lead LSU football beat reporter, and by Scott Rabalais, our venerable longtime columnist. A very unique game on deck here for LSU at 6:30 p.m., Saturday in Tiger Stadium. They welcome the Black Knights of the Hudson, the United States Military Academy, coming in here for a non-conference game in Tiger Stadium. It'll be a different type of night, a different feel, and probably a very unique, kind of a special feel for this game in Tiger Stadium that's not similar to a lot of others. So we will welcome these two gentlemen in to discuss that and many other topics. Gentlemen, welcome in.
Hey guys, how you doing?
Good to be with y'all today.
A bit of business here first. As always, if you're tuning in, you already know that The Advocate's the number one destination for LSU football coverage, and this podcast is just another way for us to bring our great coverage to you. You can catch us every Monday and Thursday. We broadcast live, and then if you don't catch us live on our social channels, on our YouTube channels, you can catch us later on our YouTube channels as well. This podcast is another way, as I said, for us to bring some great coverage to you. And if you want to follow us along, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever other finer podcasts are found. Subscribe to The Advocate if you haven't already. To do that, you go to theadvocate.com/subscribe. That's theadvocate.com/subscribe. And if you haven't already, get a hold of our newsletter. That's all the latest and greatest LSU football headlines delivered straight to your inbox. And to do that, you sign up at theadvocate.com/LSU newsletter. It's theadvocate.com/LSU newsletter. So plenty to get into here with LSU and Army. This is not a vintage Army team coming in. It's they're 2-4. Struggling on offense a good bit, and LSU should win this game comfortably. The spread is 30 points. The over/under is 58. But I thought before we got into Saturday's game, we ought to take stock of the SEC West. LSU has played five straight, as Brian Kelly has said many times now. LSU has played 5 straight SEC games. They're 4-1. They don't technically control their own fate because of that loss to Ole Miss. And so, but they are very much in the thick of it. They just need some things to sort of fall their way. Alabama on top right now at 4-0, LSU behind at 4-1, and we'll just go from there. Why don't we take stock of the SEC West? And Wilson, if you want to just go ahead and lay out what has to happen for LSU to possibly make it to Atlanta.
2 simple things: win the rest of your games and have Ole Miss lose once. That's all you need. I guess you could fall into some different kinds of scenarios and utter chaos if some other teams, lost multiple. If Alabama lost multiple games, even though you lost to Alabama or something like that. But the most simplest path forward is to certainly beat Alabama November 4th, then beat Florida, beat A&M, and just hope that somebody else takes care of Ole Miss. They got to go to Georgia. That would be maybe a logical spot where they could lose a game. They've already played. Ole Miss has LSU. Alabama, and have they gotten to Texas A&M yet? I'm suddenly blanking. If Ole Miss?
Ole Miss?
Yeah.
No, they have to play. They'll play Texas A&M on November 4th, same day as the Alabama game.
Okay, so then it could end up maybe even being a situation kind of like it was last year to an extent, where LSU wrapped up the SEC West the week after beating Alabama by beating Arkansas, and Ole Miss lost at the same time, and that sealed it up completely. And even though LSU had beaten Ole Miss the year last season, I just remember that day against Arkansas, everybody tracking what happened with the Ole Miss game that day. Was it Ole Miss? It wasn't Ole Miss Alabama, I don't think, but Ole Miss was playing somebody, and I don't remember exactly what happened. Either way, that game got wrapped up, or maybe it was because anyway, I'm suddenly forgetting everything. But that's the simplest path forward. Win out and have Ole Miss lose.
Yeah, LSU doesn't need to wind up in a 3-way tie with Alabama and Ole Miss, because then that brings all kinds of really obscure tiebreakers into play, because they would have all beaten each other.
That's
LSU,
correct.
To get to 7-1, LSU would beat Bama. Bama's beating Ole Miss. Ole Miss beat LSU. Then you start going down the list, and it could be pretty strange. So I don't know all the tiebreakers. I'm not going to sit here and go through them all, because
that is
it's
something
too
we will get to later as we go down the road.
But it's much easier if LSU just has a little help from Georgia. And in a way, maybe they don't want Alabama to lose this Saturday to Tennessee because that could benefit LSU if they stay tied with Alabama. If it's just LSU because if it's LSU and Ole Miss head to head, if Ole Miss somehow upset Georgia and LSU beat Alabama, well, LSU's going to lose out. But I think LSU's in a pretty good spot. Other than you say, well, they got to go beat Bama on the road, and Florida looks better coming to Tiger Stadium in November. But the way the LSU's offense is playing, every game is certainly winnable. So it's not a bad position for LSU to be in, considering that their season was kind of given up for lost after the loss to Ole Miss.
So Ole Miss remaining on their schedule, they have they're at Auburn. They play Vanderbilt at home, Texas A&M at home, then at Georgia, ULM, and at Mississippi State. Is there anybody else you could see out of those five, Auburn, Texas A&M, Vanderbilt, Georgia, and Mississippi, besides Georgia? Do you see any of those other teams posing a threat to maybe knock off Ole Miss when they thought that they should probably have that game?
They go to Starkville for the Egg Bowl.
They do.
Right?
They do.
That's always a threat. It's such a intense rivalry game. We don't think of it that way, like same terms as the Iron Bowl or maybe Texas, Oklahoma, or Ohio State, Michigan. But those people really hate each other's guts, and anything can happen in that rivalry. And with Will Rogers and Miss State, they're winless in conference, but it would make their season to upset Ole Miss's season. Remember, Ole Miss has never been to the SEC championship game, hasn't won the SEC in 60 years.
Yep.
So it would give them great pleasure to knock them off. So obviously A&M is a threat, but I think that game in Starkville, you never know what could happen.
A&M would be the other one for me when you look at that, because of what A&M has on defense is still, their season has not been the way that they would have wanted it to go. Then again, when has it gone the way A&M wants it to go? They just haven't really proven themselves as a true contender under Jimbo, and yet they still have a strong defensive front in particular, something that we'll have to look at, closer to LSU's game against A&M. That's going to make might make things tough on LSU at the end of November, but that could, slow down Ole Miss's offense, and maybe Max Johnson can make some plays there. That would be the other one on that schedule that would stand out to me.
Speaking of the big glowing red light on the schedule, obviously, is Georgia. I would just ask you, Wilson, if you think, Georgia's number one team in the nation, hasn't lost in forever. They maybe haven't looked quite as strong, as complete this season as they had in the previous 2 years. And then, of course, now this week we see that tight end Brock Bowers, the All-American, had to have tightrope surgery, and so he's probably out 4 to 6, which is basically the rest of the regular season. We'll probably miss the Ole Miss game. I just bring that up just to say, could Georgia be had by Ole Miss when they go in there in a couple of weeks?
Oh, absolutely. Georgia is not invincible. I don't think there's a single team this year that is, and they looked dominant against Kentucky. And so when you looked at sort of from a national landscape, it was like, oh, that's why Georgia's number one. It's not just the fact that they've won 2 straight national championships. It's okay, there's that team again. But then a week later, they kind of mess around with Vanderbilt a little bit. It was never all that close, but especially in the second half, but it was just sort of rocky. And of course, Bowers got hurt, and that's the best player on the team and one of the best players in all of college football. Someone who started getting sort of looked at as maybe even like a fringe Heisman person, not necessarily like an actual Heisman candidate, but like, oh, I wonder if a tight end could get in there, kind of thing. Made you think about it.
Yeah,
made you think about it. And then, of course, he's hurt, and which just stinks for college football because he's a really talented player. But certainly they can be had. This defense hasn't looked quite like it did the last 2 years. They're not as outside of the Kentucky game when they did stop the run, they haven't been as strong stopping the run as they were the last 2 seasons. So, no, they can certainly be had. Ole Miss has an explosive offense. We saw that firsthand when LSU went up there. And the thing that would maybe tip the scales in Georgia's favor is that it's in Athens.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be something that Ole Miss would have to overcome.
That game obviously is not in LSU's control. None of these games that these other teams are playing are obviously in LSU's control. The only thing that, as the coaches like to say, the only thing they control is what's ahead of them. And directly ahead of them, of course, is Army. This is, as I said, not a vintage Army team. They're 2-4 coming in. They're really going through something of a transition on offense. It's not a complete revamp, but it's a transition of sorts on offense for Army because for forever and ever and ever, the service academies, sort of, they made their bones using triple option. And Jeff Monken, the coach at Army, felt like they couldn't necessarily do that anymore because the NCAA this year legislated out the ability to cut block outside the tackle. So they're going through it. They're going through quite a transition. This year, 194 rushing yards per game. Last year, they were averaging 289 rushing yards per game. They're passing more. They're not passing a ton, but they're passing more. They averaged 76 yards per game last year. Now they average 143 yards per game. A game like this used to be so difficult to have to wrestle with in the middle of a season if you were the opponent, because you had to put in the work defending against the triple option and practicing against it, because otherwise you were going to be in for a difficult afternoon, and then you couldn't really take that, and apply it toward the rest of the season in terms of the other teams you had to play. So anyway, what should we expect in terms of what we'll see out of Army and what LSU has to do to get ahead and to win comfortably?
So one of Army's offensive linemen, their team captain, his name's Connor Finucane. He's from Catholic High here in Baton Rouge. At one point in his career, I think he said this was last year, he created almost like a Bible for all the offensive linemen on Army's team about the principles needed to run the triple option, because there was so much else that went into it, as opposed to a different offense. This thing was like about 15 pages or so with all these things that he had laid out for them to need to know. It doesn't exist anymore. It's not needed anymore. And I asked him yesterday, well, what would that look like now? He's like 2 or 3 pages. Like, it's mostly like our job is much more simple than it used to be. But there's a lot more on the quarterbacks and the receivers, and they're going through it, trying to transition. We were talking about Mississippi State a minute ago, and that's an offense that is trying to change from a very specific identity to something else, and that takes time. You have to recruit to that. Army has got a lot of players. I talked to Jeff Monken about this yesterday, who are used to the triple option and the traditional sort of triple option. This is still got some triple option principles coming out of shotgun, and so it's just not the same. And they are, sort of haven't been as successful with that. And those players clearly feel it. Connor, in particular, is certainly wants them to be better desperately as a team captain, and somebody who is clearly very passionate about everything that they're doing up there. But it is still just an offense that hasn't clicked for them necessarily yet, because it's much different from what they had to run before.
Yeah, the thing about the triple option for Army and all the service academies have been it's an equalizer in terms of it negates the other team's talent advantage, and obviously LSU has an enormous talent advantage over a team like Army that just can't recruit at that same level. Because you for one thing, they're so disciplined at it, and it's so hard for you to prepare for it because you don't prepare for this all the time. I remember back in the day, when I was a kid, like in high school or something, watching teams run the wishbone and stuff like that. You had a lot of teams like that. You don't see teams anymore do it now in your conference, and now you're seeing even less. So they have to be more of a traditional offense, and that puts them at a disadvantage. I guess I'm not surprised to see that they're 2-4 coming into this game. Because Army's had some good solid teams in recent years.
Certainly in recent years,
yeah. So this has kind of probably hurt them in that regard. And like I said, on top of that, as Wilson said, they're making a transition. So I think Army is going to still have to try to, as with Auburn last week, somehow shorten the game. Try to run the ball as best they can. Maybe a controlled passing game, short passes. Try to keep the ball out of LSU's offensive hands and also run the clock, which the new clock rules help them a little bit. But it's a much taller order now for Army to come to Tiger Stadium and try to give LSU a game, and it's much less a scary game on the schedule as it maybe looked when LSU first scheduled Army, I guess, 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you mentioned the offense. Talking to Jeff Monken yesterday, you could tell that he knew that this was an intimidating task. He goes, that offense is like a video game.
Well, it's true. 530 yards per game? No, 550 yards per game.
550.
They are obviously led by Jaden Daniels. They're number 2 in the nation in yards per game, 550.4. And we've talked about Jaden Daniels ad nauseum. We've talked about the success that Logan Diggs has had coming along. We've talked about the wideouts, all of them, all the weapons. And we'll get into Kyren Lacy and the splash he made last week. in a bit. But one thing we haven't really talked about a ton is the offensive line. Wilson, you noted that this week the offensive line is sort of a mid-season finalist, so to speak, for the Joe Moore Award. Explain to everybody what the Joe Moore Award is, first of all, which the LSU team offensive line won in 2019, what it is, and why they've done so well.
It goes to the best offensive line in college football, a way to recognize them. There's some individual awards for offensive linemen, but this goes to the full unit, and this thing is massive. I remember it getting sort of like wheeled into the facility in 2019. It's not something you can just pick up. This thing is a massive trophy, and it stays with the offensive line that won it for a year, and then moves on to whatever other team has won it. And so, Will Campbell was asked about it on Tuesday. He said, in his typical Will Campbell voice, which is I can't properly replicate, unfortunately. But he goes, to me, that's just a Twitter post. We want to be the one at the end of the year that actually wins it. And so, what's made them so good is there's been such a change from the Florida State game in terms of their run blocking in particular. Pass pro, I think, has always pretty much been there this year. But their run blocking, they've just gotten much more physical. LSU doesn't do a whole lot of exotic sort of run schemes. A lot of it's building off of RPOs or sort of read option action, and a lot of sort of inside handoffs, at least between the tackles. You don't see like multiple pulling linemen usually or anything like that, but it's sort of like an offense. The run schemes are sort of predicated on just being able to beat the man across from you. They weren't against Florida State, and so they're having some trouble, and they have ever since then. They've just been really physical, and they've been able to blow some teams off the ball, and just get a really impressive amount of push. And then, open up space for Logan Diggs and these other running backs, to pick up a lot of yards. But Logan Diggs, I wish I had the exact stat, but it just feels like he is rarely touched behind the line of scrimmage. And that's a credit to the offensive line. They're playing a really good football right now. This is one of the best offensive lines that LSU's had in a while. And that's hard to quantify, maybe where it is like all time kind of thing, but there's a lot of talent up front. And, this week they might not have Emery. They probably won't have Emery Jones. Most likely Lance Hurd will be getting his first start. But even then, you don't expect too much of a drop off against Army.
No, that's the one place where they've been able to build some really good depth. Moving Lance Hurd in there and then moving Emery Jones inside to the right guard spot. But they should be handle. It's a perfect situation for LSU. You never want injuries, obviously, but this is the perfect scenario for LSU. You can get by Army without Emery Jones. You got an open date week next week, and then you try to have him back as close to full strength as you can for the Alabama game. Same on the other side of the ball with Mekhi Wingo, who's probably not going to play this week either. He's been playing with injuries, right? So
he's been just sort of nicked up and battling.
So this is a good time for this. But you look at this whole offense, and you obviously focus on the skill players who've been dazzling. Jaden Daniels and Malik Nabers and Kyren Lacy and Brian Thomas and Logan Diggs now, who has emerged from the pack in a way that was hard to predict, early in the season. But football is still a basic game for all the bells and whistles. It's still blocking and tackling, and to see the offensive line more often than not, I don't know, most of the game, but a lot of times. Wilson, we're watching the game, and they're getting the push, and like you said, it's a very good point to make. Logan Diggs rarely gets touched in the backfield, and they're opening holes, and Diggs is not encountering anybody until he gets past the line of scrimmage sometimes, which is a huge recipe for success, obviously. So it's a part of the game that gets overlooked a lot, but it shouldn't be with this offense. Yeah, they've got great skill players, but they've also got an offensive line that is veteran and experienced and has a lot of chemistry. And if you're concerned going into next year for LSU, this is one part of the team where with the skill players they're likely to lose, that you probably should feel very good. They'll lose Charles Turner most likely, but they got some very talented and experienced guys coming back for 24 as well.
Yeah, if you start to look at it, and this is projecting probably way too far in advance because we don't know exactly what guys are going to do and all that. But yeah, your bookend tackles are both sophomores. They're coming back. And even if Miles Frazier, who would be draft eligible, your right guard, leaves, then you kick Emery Jones inside, which is where he projects at the next level. Lance Hurd starts at right tackle. Garrett Dellinger will also be draft eligible, but maybe he has a very, very real possibility he comes back. Then you have your left guard back, and then you're really just having to replace your center And you've got, I think, some trust right now in maybe what DJ Chester can start to do there. Again, long way to go. But that is a group that you feel really good about. And so, and speaking of Miles Frazier, who we haven't maybe talked about a lot, he got a bad rap coming out of the Florida State game. He did not play well in that game. Florida State was dogging him and identifying him as a weakness on that offensive line. And then for a few weeks there, LSU, like you said, was rotating and putting in Lance Hurd at right tackle and kicking in Emery Jones to right guard and taking Miles out of the lineup at times. And then he just sort of took hold of that spot again. He is until Emery Jones got hurt, Lance Hurd was not playing. And because of what Miles Frazier was doing at right guard. So credit to him for responding to from that season opener, not having a good game, locking down his spot again, because he's been a piece of that offensive line. And Charles Turner too, somebody who has often been talked about as being undersized. He does a lot of things to make up for that. And this week he was the Outland Trophy National Player of the Week. For how he played against Auburn, coming off of a hyperextended knee. A week later, he's back in the game and doing everything you need to as a center to lead that offensive line. That's another guy that deserves quite a bit of credit.
It starts up front, and just as LSU as a team has gotten better since the beginning of the season, so too has the offensive line. This is the LSU Sports Insider podcast brought to you by the journalists at The Advocate, NOLA.com, and the Times-Picayune. If you'd like to subscribe to The Advocate, please do so. You can subscribe to our print edition or our digital edition. You go to theadvocate.com/subscribe. That's theadvocate.com/subscribe. And please, if you haven't already, sign up for our LSU newsletter. Rab handles that 3 times a week, but it's a daily newsletter. To sign up, get all the latest headlines to your inbox, you go to theadvocate.com/LSU newsletter. That's theadvocate.com/LSU newsletter. And to enjoy this fine podcast, you can find us on Apple, Spotify, or other similar channels, and also via our YouTube channels. You mentioned, we mentioned very, very, very briefly all the weapons that LSU's had at its disposal on offense, and one that we haven't talked a lot about is Kyren Lacy. Kyren Lacy had kind of up and down all the way up until Saturday against Auburn. 4 catches, 111 yards, 1 touchdown. He's got 280 yards and 3 touchdowns this season. Wilson, you brought this up, and I thought it was a topic that was certainly worth discussion. You've got Malik Nabers, All-American caliber. Brian Thomas, All-American caliber. Mason Taylor, who's sort of been bothered all year by an injury, he's sort of starting to re-emerge. If you wind up all of a sudden with Logan Diggs, Mason Taylor, Malik Nabers, Brian Thomas, and now Kyren Lacy, to sort of really fortify that receiving core into being 3 legitimate threats that you have to really, as a defense, you have to honor and respect. I mean, can the offense start humming even more? Can it get even better? Is that possible?
Yeah, think back to 2019 when you had the tandem of Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. You also had Terrace Marshall. You also had Thad Moss and of course Clyde. I mean, gosh, it was just an embarrassment of riches. But whenever some teams were trying to do something maybe to take away, Chase and Jefferson in particular, you really couldn't because LSU would just go to Terrace Marshall or go to Thad Moss. And so, I thought that for a few weeks ago, like, they don't really, maybe a third receiver isn't that big of a deal if someone doesn't emerge because you've got these 2 that are just lighting it up. But you saw Auburn in this game, Brian Thomas only had 2 catches. Malik Nabers still had a good game, but he didn't go over 100 yards. Maybe because of some of the things that Auburn was trying to do. Brian Kelly talked recently about how teams are starting to do some different things coverage-wise, play quarters, try to take away some of those deep shots. Well, it opened things up for Kyren Lacy. And one of the things that Jaden Daniels has done so well this year is know where he's going with the football and be able to identify who that open receiver is going to be. And Kyren Lacy was the beneficiary of that. And so it was still, I think, even an up and down until halftime. He had a bad drop in the first half. But he was able to come back out and, have a really strong second half and redeem himself in a way that he had not yet this season. Drops have been a problem for him at times this year. He's had moments in between them, but never a sustained game quite like this. It was really just two routes over the middle that resulted in a lot of his stuff. But also, he's done a good job when he has gotten the ball in his hands. You've seen some moments, and particularly in this game, when he gets the ball in his hands, he can be pretty slippery.
Yes.
He caught that pass over the middle and avoided like 5 tackles to set up LSU's touchdown to go up 34-10. And so, if LSU if he can emerge a little bit more as a really viable number 3, kind of eradicate some of those drops, and then that's just somebody else that defenses have to account for, and it just makes an offense even harder to defend when you have to think about, okay, well, we can't forget about this guy too.
The comparison to Terrace Marshall is quite apt, obviously, from the 2019 team. And you look at the big picture of this offense, and we've become kind of comfortable saying it's the best offense since 2019, and the best offense, it's implying that it's the second best offense in LSU history, or the way they've played so far. But they're kind of narrowing the gap a little bit. I don't know if we can ever say, you had the Heisman winner and the Biletnikoff winner on that team, and all.
They played so many top 10 teams that year too.
Yeah, and first round draft pick, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was a first round draft pick and everything, but they're really doing pretty well, and they have done something that team didn't do. Not that it was a great failing. The 2019 team played 15 games. They had 4 games where they didn't eclipse 500 yards, and they never did it 6 games in a row like LSU has. And as we said, 6 games in a row, 5 of those against SEC teams. They're not doing it against a bunch of rental wins. The Grambling game was a game where obviously it got way out of hand, but it's quite impressive. And if you add I would love to sit in a meeting room with an opposing defensive coordinator and just watch them go, oh my God, there's that guy, and there's that guy, and there's that guy. And if you cover them all, Jaden Daniels takes off if he's got any kind of crack, and he's gone for 28 yards. So it's like, it's really something to watch.
It is. And just as a quick aside, I think this is something, I'm just going to tease something that's coming up in a few weeks. I got to sit with Malik Nabers for a few minutes earlier this week, and you're talking about I wonder what defensive coordinator's going to do. Yeah, me too. It made me think of this because he started diagramming some plays. And he was like, okay, well, yeah, if the safety does this, then we're just going to do this. And if the corner drops this way, then we're just doing that. And I was like, he's like, we always kind of know where we're going with the ball. I'm like, wait, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, I mean, all of us can see, if the safety drops, or does a certain thing, depending on whatever the play is going to be. He's like, all of us know exactly where Jaden's going with the ball. Right. That. And that, I just don't know how you defend that on a week in and week out basis.
Well, that also speaks to not only a wealth of talent on that LSU offense, but also a wealth of players who know what they're doing. High football IQ, as you might say.
Yeah, it's time together that they've spent over a year. That you're really seeing that.
It's a big advantage. I remember Joe Burrow saying something that year is like, they can't. They could counter everything the defense would do, and I think that's kind of what Malik is saying, because they have such good chemistry as well as being talented players. He spoke in his interview of knowing what Jaden's going to do. They just have like a look or something like that. Yeah, okay, or just a couple of words, and they know where to go. It's something to see.
We discussed Kyren Lacy sort of coming on very, just now. Another player on the other side who has sort of reemerged is linebacker Omar Speights. He's been wrestling with a hip flexor injury. It's easier said than done. A hip flexor injury that's been bothering him since the Grambling game, kind of in and out. Whit Weeks obviously made a splash in his place, but he came back into the starting lineup, 8 tackles against Auburn, 21 this season. And just to sort of lay out how nice it's been to have him back in the lineup.
Yeah, Omar is someone who, when they came into this season, they thought extremely highly of. This was the linebacker who they went out and they got in the transfer portal to ease a lot of concerns that they were at that position. Someone with a ton of experience who had played quite a bit of football. And as the entire defense struggled, Omar didn't look great in the opener. And, then he didn't do much in the first half against Grambling before he went out with the hip flexor injury. And then even then he comes back, he plays in the first half against Ole Miss. But again, that's another game where LSU is getting torched.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if it's necessarily Omar Speights or if it's necessarily just LSU struggling with everything on defense at that time, because you could see it against Auburn, some of what he does very well. And he had 8 tackles. He was going sideline to sideline, and asked Brian Kelly about him this week. And Kelly said, and really just specifically, what did you like about Omar Speights? And he even brought up the Whit Weeks comparison because that's the two that are always going to get kind of compared at this point of the season. Greg Penn, we know, is going to kind of always be on the field. And then it's Weeks or Speights, with Speights coming back. And he said that Weeks can just flat out run. His athleticism, his speed, he makes plays just because he is so athletic, and he also just his attitude, he just attacks the football. And that's a great thing to have. The thing that Kelly likes about Omar Speights is that he is really good at fitting plays the way they need to be fit, and his experience. Kelly often says, and he says it's about Omar Speights too, that you really can't, there's no substitute for experience.
Yeah. And
that's kind of the thing that Omar has going for him in a lot of ways over Whit at this point, is that he's seen and played a lot of football at a high level. And so, as he comes back to full health against Auburn, he played pretty much the entire game. Whit only had 9 defensive snaps. Could there be more of a role for Whit Weeks? Is there an argument for there to be more of a role for Whit Weeks? Certainly. But that's at least the way that LSU is kind of approaching it very clearly. Just by the snap share in that game, Omar is going to be the person who's on the field more often, probably moving forward.
Rab, you mentioned earlier when we were talking about the offensive line, it's still a simple game, blocking and tackling. I would say tackling. Omar Speights is tackling. The other defensive players on the front 7 are tackling. The safeties are tackling. How big is that? Just tackle. Make a sound tackle.
Yeah, the way we've heard Brian Kelly talk about Whit Weeks during the season, it's like he's ready to adopt him. I mean, he's just so enamored with him and his speed and everything. But he's still young. He's going to make those freshman mistakes. But is Omar maybe as dynamic a player, or as Whit? Maybe not. But he's going to be that solid presence that Wilson alluded to.
And he can do a lot of different things. We saw in his tape at Oregon State that he was somebody who could cover in the slot, and he could really play in a lot of different sort of alignments and do some different things. And there was a lot of reason to be excited about him. You just haven't really seen it yet. And one point real quick about Whit, sorry to interrupt you, Rab, but Whit himself, it just came into my mind when we were talking to Whit a few weeks ago. He said it himself, like he's still on the field at that time, like looking to Greg Penn, what do I do?
What do I do?
Yeah. And you want players like that. I mean, and you want a dynamic player like Harold Perkins, obviously, and someone with great skill like Whit Weeks. But you want that solid presence, especially now when you're trying just to elevate the defense into being just something better than it's been.
Well, you have a chance to improve. Presumably, you have a chance to improve yet another game here against Army going into the open week, followed by the Big Goon, Alabama, Nick Saban on November 4th. So, with that in mind, because there is a game Saturday, we should discuss it. What does LSU need to do to sort of make sure they take care of this game comfortably? And really, more to that point, I guess one of the things we really haven't discussed yet that we should. We're probably thinking that LSU would like to take care of business maybe by halftime and then start taking a long look at reserves. Obviously, with the way that redshirt rules work now, you can take a look at some of these younger players and not necessarily burn their redshirt. And even if they're not redshirting, maybe some of these younger guys who've already played get a chance to get in. You get a long look at them. Rab, generally speaking, whom would you like to see out of the sort of the reserves and the young players get a shot to play on the field and put something on tape?
I'm going to make kind of a default statement. I want to see more Caleb Jackson. I want to see him out there returning a kick, running over some defender or something like that, because the kid is exciting to watch. So that's what I want to see. And I think he's potentially also the future for LSU at running back. So that's who I want to see. Give me more Caleb Jackson wherever I can get him. And by the way, I want to insert real quick, speaking of Brian Kelly, he's going for his 300th career win Saturday night
on the field. It's got to come on
the field. Yeah, there were some games they had to forfeit at Notre Dame, but on the field, in 33 years as a coach, that's quite impressive. But that's not the biggest thing for LSU Saturday, obviously, but it's something someone's going to write about in their column on Saturday game day. But I want to see more Caleb Jackson for sure. I hope LSU, for their sake, needs to get off to a quick start. Kelly's preached intensity and focus this week. Get a big lead and then get to some valuable snaps for these players who have not maybe gotten them in recent games.
I'm going to start with I'm going to list out a few players. I want to see more of Quincy Wiggins and Deshaun Womack. We've not seen Quincy Wiggins at all this season.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not. I don't think there's any necessarily like reason. Is just let's be able to check in and see where he's at in his development. You know, Quincy's came in is someone who was very raw and needed some time to get better, but physically there's so much there that that really excites you about what he could be as a player. And so, you know, him and Deshaun as well, you know, Deshaun is still someone who is not really there as like a run defender yet, but as a pass rusher, he's got a lot to like. And so this is the kind of game where maybe you can get him on the field a little bit more and start to hone in on some of those things. So those two I want to see on the defensive side in particular. And then I really want to see more of Garrett Nussmeier. I mean, because of what Jaden Daniels has done this season and the nature of the close games that LSU has played, Garrett has thrown 11 passes all season.
Right. And we see much less of them than we expected.
Yeah. And, you know, the only reason he even played against Missouri was because Jaden got hurt for 3 plays. And that whole offensive series got kind of thrown out of whack with the high snap and all that. But he was 0 for 2 on that series as a result. And so I'd want to see more of Garrett in the second half. And not just Garrett handing the ball off, but let's see if, you know, maybe he can come and actually like just have a chance to actually make some throws. And again, sort of check in on where he's at, how he's progressing, because we know it's there. We saw it the second half of last season, but like you said, there's been no reason to play him up until this point. But this game, Georgia State too, are probably, unless you end up like really getting up big in a game, or you know, God forbid for LSU getting really down in a game, there's no real probably not another chance other than those two to really see him the rest of the regular season, and then the postseason, we'll see what that brings. So Garrett would be another one. And then also some of these freshman receivers like Shelton Sampson, Jalen Brown, Kyle Parker. Who are these? How are they looking right now? Because those are going to be the guys who are really going to have to step up next year when Malik Nabers and Brian Thomas assumedly, you know, go on to the NFL because they're both draft eligible. The way they're playing, that would be, I think, a reasonable thing to expect them to do.
They're not likely to come back. I think that's a fair assessment, and nobody could blame them. In much the same way that Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, exited soon after the 2019 season. Well, look, there's a lot to get to. Obviously, over the next 5 games now we've got left here in this football season for LSU. Starting with Army, and then we will head into the open date, and after that, it's the big one. It's Alabama. That'll be on November 4th. Obviously, we'll be here throughout football season and beyond. We will be here Mondays and Thursdays, everywhere on our YouTube channels, on our social channels, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. Again, as always, as I say, if you haven't subscribed to The Advocate already, please do. Go to theadvocate.com/subscribe. That's theadvocate.com/subscribe. And again, if you haven't gotten a hold of our LSU newsletter, please do so. You can sign up at theadvocate.com/LSU newsletter. That's theadvocate.com/LSU newsletter. We'll be here throughout football season and beyond. Basketball is coming up, women's basketball, men's basketball, baseball, the whole works. So stick with The Advocate. My name's Perryn Keys. I'm the executive sports editor for Wilson Alexander and Scott Rabalais, saying thank you. This has been the LSU Sports Insider.